There's no news here except yellow fever and politics, and I don't know which is the greater curse. I prefer the fever.
Politicians realized that Louisiana had plenty of other things worth stealing besides votes, like money. And the best way to take people's money was to get them to hand it over freely. Of course, they didn't call it stealing. They called it a lottery.
The 19th century Louisiana Lottery was a private firm that had been given a monopoly on the numbers racket by the state legislature. They were notorious for paying off both sides of the aisle. Whether Republican or Democrat, it didn't make any difference. Whoever was in power was still beholden to the state lottery.
The corporation sold tickets nationwide, bringing in an estimated $20 to $30 million each year. Much less than half of that was paid out in prizes. That's why the Louisiana State Lottery Company could afford to make Louisiana's politicians the best bribe leaders in the country. At the center of the lottery's power was the state treasurer, an almost legendary rogue named Edward A. Burke.
He was, without question, one of the strongest figures during this period. And he's also, given the history of Louisiana, this may be an incredibly monumental achievement. He's probably the biggest crook the state has ever known.
Eventually, the federal government would bring down the lottery. As for Edward Burke, he disappeared in Honduras. An audit of the state treasury revealed that nearly $1.3 million had vanished with him. But while some got rich from stealing, others stubbornly insisted on doing things the hard way. That is, they made money by working for it.
The Iron Horse will speed its way from Shreveport to Louisville through Bossier Parish. The construction of the Shreveport and Arkansas Road will bring into market thousands of valuable acres of land. It's the earnest hope of the times that railroad construction has just begun in Bossier, and that in the course of a few years, every parish in North Louisiana will be traversed by several railways.
Investment in the railroad industry transformed rural Louisiana. Just as towns had sprung up along Louisiana's riverfronts in the century before, depot towns became vital ports along the state's growing stretch of railways.
The railroads were essentially built by national interests. The big railroad builders were the Goulds and the Fisk and the big-time investors. It was costly, but by the 1870s, railroads were pretty much crucial to transportation across Louisiana.
Most of Louisiana's people were desperately poor, but the land was rich in natural resources. This drew the attention of investors and entrepreneurs from the north.
In Louisiana and Mississippi especially, well over half of the firms operating in the lumber industry in Louisiana are owned outside of the region.
After exhausting the white pine forest of the Great Lakes, lumber companies moved into the Gulf Coast region, where there were vast virgin stands of longleaf pine and cypress trees, some of them centuries old. Within a few years, the state became the world's leading lumber producer. But the business brought here by the lumber companies came at a high price.
And the environmental consequences at a time when no one thought of reforestation were tremendous.
Along with the railroads and lumber companies, an entirely new industry surged forward in Louisiana. In 1901, outside the southwestern town of Jennings, Louisiana's first commercial oil well came in. Over the next 100 years, nothing else would change Louisiana's economy, culture, and landscape as much as this one discovery.
Before long, the oil industry centered around Shreveport, west of Shreveport, Caddo Lake, Pine Island, and those regions. And the big oil companies that came were associated with Standard Oil of New Jersey, which built a refinery in Baton Rouge in 1909.
It was the largest refinery in the world. Still, at the start of the 20th century, for all its natural resources, the state generally lacked the means to manufacture goods. Louisiana remained a place for outside economic powers to exploit for profit, just as it had been during colonial days.
It was economic incentive that brought them here, and they made money and sometimes left behind a wasteland.
Traditional crops like cotton and sugar were still grown in Louisiana, but advances in agriculture made it possible to cultivate a new cash crop, rice. Good rice harvests brought new farmers to Louisiana, and to the farmers already here, they brought solid profits.
Today, there are 25,000 settlers ready to tell you that it is the most prosperous portion of the South. Many of the poor Acadian natives who had not tilled this soil, had never attended school, and could not speak a word of English, are today wealthy farmers.
Beginning in the 1880s, Louisiana growers were joined by masses of Italian immigrants, primarily from Sicily. Many of these newcomers eventually moved to the cities, establishing themselves as leaders in the food distribution industry. While recent arrivals and longtime Louisianians alike struggled to transform their lives for the better, the Bourbon aristocrats continued to work hard to preserve a Louisiana whose time had long since passed. But now, slowly but surely, momentous changes were beginning to trickle through Louisiana.
Very many men and women soon realized the need of full suffrage for women. The day has dawned for women's full enfranchisement in Louisiana.
America's women did indeed win the right to vote in 1920, thanks in part to the efforts of New Orleans suffragists like Elizabeth Lyle Saxon, Carolyn Merrick, and the Gordon sisters Kate and Jean. With the ballot, they were more able than ever to hasten that onward march by pushing for progressive changes in Louisiana. Topping the long list of needed reforms was education.
One of the real tragedies of Reconstruction becomes the fact that the white conservative Democrats who take over in 1877 reduce dramatically spending for education, for blacks especially, but for whites as well. And that post-Reconstruction abandonment of public education, which I don't think is too strong a term to describe it, has tremendous implications for Louisiana throughout the 20th century, and my guess is into the 21st century.
Ironically, most of Louisiana's present-day colleges and universities were founded in the decades following Reconstruction. And with modest increases in funding for public education under Governor Newton C. Blanchard, more students were prepared to enroll in those colleges. But if glimmers of progress had begun to dawn for some, life remained as bleak as ever for a great many more.